Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. The Ministry of Human Resources and Development has published the National Institutional Ranking Framework for 2020. The NIRF is a ranking methodology for universities and colleges that was adopted by the MHRD in 2015. Under this ranking methodology, various universities and colleges in the country are ranked under different categories such as engineering, law, management, architecture, etc. After this ranking methodology was adopted by the MHRD in 2015, the first ranking list was published in 2016 and since then it is being published every year. This article talks about the top institutions and universities in this year's ranking list. This includes several IITs, JNU, the Indian Institute of Science, IIMs, National Law School, etc. But this ranking list is not really relevant for our exams. But what we need to understand is that these elite Indian institutions and Indian universities in higher education, how do they perform globally? If you look at global university rankings, even elite Indian institutions such as IITs, IIMs, the Indian Institute of Science, etc., they perform very poorly. See, there are a few university rankings that are considered as a global standard, and one of them happens to be the QS World University Rankings. The 2020 edition of the QS World University Rankings, which provides the list of rankings for 2021, was released just a couple of days ago, and to India's shock, not a single Indian university is in the top 100 of this ranking list. So this clearly shows how poorly Indian universities perform when it comes to global rankings, and hence it is very important for us to understand the reasons behind it. If you ask me why Indian universities rank so poorly in global rankings, I can point out these 5 reasons. 1. The difference in ranking methodology. 2. The poor infrastructure of Indian universities. 3rd. The lack of focus on research and development. 4th. The lack of interaction with the industry. And 5th. Poor international outreach of Indian universities. See, in order to understand how ranking methodology can play a role, first we need to understand the different parameters that are used in each ranking methodology and understand whether the ranking methodology is more inclined towards measuring perceptions or towards measuring facts. Say if the ranking parameters are more inclined towards measuring facts, such as faculty to student ratio, number of PhDs, number of research papers published, etc., then we can say that the ranking methodology is more objective. But this is more of a textbook approach to measure the performance of a university. Then on the other hand, if the ranking parameters are more inclined towards measuring perceptions, that is the perception of the university from academic peers, from employers, etc., then the ranking would be more subjective, and this would provide a more real world representation of the performance of the university. So any ranking methodology will include a mix of both subjective and objective factors, and the balance between the two will determine how the ranking methodology is trying to determine the performance of the universities. See, if you look at global rankings, such as the QS World University Rankings, they are more perception driven. They provide a higher weightage to factors such as academic reputation, employer reputation, and other factors such as international faculty ratio, international student ratio, etc. These factors are given a weightage of nearly 60 to 70% in the ranking methodology. Whereas other objective factors such as faculty to student ratio, citations per faculty are given very low weightage, and it is hardly in the range of 10 to 15%. So this clearly shows that global rankings are more perception driven and they give a relatively lower weightage for objective facts, and such a ranking methodology is bound to affect the ranking of Indian universities which have not paid much attention to grooming their perception. On the other hand, the NIRF ranking methodology developed by the Ministry of Human Resource Development is more objective driven and gives a higher priority for facts as compared to perceptions. Under NIRF, the key parameters are teaching, learning and resources, research and professional practice, graduation outcomes, outreach and inclusivity. The first 4 parameters are not only more objective and fact oriented, but they also give a priority for socio-economic inclusion, And this can be considered to be relevant in the context of a developing country such as India. But the inclusion parameter is not included in global rankings. Under the inclusion parameter of the NIRF, the percentage of students from other states and countries are measured in order to measure regional diversity, the percentage of women, the percentage of economically socially challenged students, and the percentage of physically challenged students is also measured in order to account for gender inclusivity and socio-economic inclusion. If you look at global rankings, the inclusion parameter would be missing. But the government of India, which has always criticized global rankings for adopting a flawed methodology and for being biased against Indian universities, it has naturally given a very low weightage to perceptions under the NIRF. That's the reason why I said that the NIRF is more objective, because it gives very little scope for subjectivity in the form of how the university is perceived by academic peers and employers. But see, such a ranking methodology might help boost the performance of Indian universities in the domestic rankings, but it does not really help improve their performance in global rankings. Because a fact-driven ranking methodology ignores the significance of perceptions, especially in the field of education, where the perception of the industry and academic peers plays a critical role in the development of opportunities at the university. See, over the years, Indian higher education institutions, especially the elite institutions such as IITs, Indian Institute of Science, etc., they have done considerably well to improve their infrastructure, to increase their investments and focus on research and development, to increase industry interaction, and to attract more international faculty and international students. But this alone will not help the Indian universities to improve their global rankings, and for this, they need to work on their academic reputation, especially amongst academic peers. They need to work on their industry and employer reputation. They need to strive towards attracting more international faculty and international students. As of now, most of the international students who come to India to study are from developing and underdeveloped countries. There are hardly any students coming in from developed countries to study in Indian universities. This is a result of lack of international outreach of Indian universities. Even when you look at research opportunities and employment opportunities at Indian universities, you will find that they perform very poorly as compared to their global counterparts. This is mainly because Indian universities are not very proactive in tying up with the industry and in tying up with research institutions. Through the NIRF ranking methodology, the government in a way is encouraging the Indian universities to focus more on faculty to student ratio, number of PhDs, number of papers being published. Yes, these parameters are definitely important for a university, but it cannot afford to ignore the perception of academic peers, the perception of the industry, and the perception of the international faculty and student community. So along with infrastructure, research and development, faculty student ratio, research papers, etc., Indian universities need to focus on building their reputation and their perception at the global level. And it is only a combination of these factors which can help the Indian universities to rank higher in global university rankings. Now let's take up a column from page number 6, written by Gopal Krishna Gandhi, who was a former IAS officer, a former diplomat, a former governor, and also happens to be the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi. In this column, he talks about three social evils, that is caste, class, and race, that has affected three different societies in the past in three different ways. In the case of India, the caste system has created an inherent divide in the society, leading to centuries of oppression of the lower castes. In the white-dominated societies of United States and South Africa, racism has led to decades of oppression and discrimination against the blacks. So such divides on the basis of one's birth, one's color, one's religion, etc., inherently creates a class divide as well in the society, which is nearly universal to all the societies around the world. In this context, the writer talks about historical figures such as Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, and their ideals, and how they fought against these social evils, and how they championed and led a fight against elitism of caste, race, etc. Talking about Mahatma Gandhi and his contribution, the writer reminds us of a trivial incident that took place at the Pietermaritzburg railway station in South Africa on the 7th of June 1893, which single-handedly changed the course of colonial history. This, of course, is a reference to the place and date where Mahatma Gandhi was thrown out of a train for being a brown, and this humiliating and discriminatory incident motivated Mahatma Gandhi to lead a struggle which inspired millions of people around the world that led British colonies such as India, Mauritius, and South Africa towards independence. He talks about how Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King, inspired by the ideals and values of Mahatma Gandhi, led their own struggles in South Africa and the United States, respectively. He reminds us how Nelson Mandela fought against apartheid in South Africa through the simple act of peaceful resistance. He reminds us of Martin Luther King's popular statement, "I have a dream," and how he led the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s, which finally resulted in the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which brought racial discrimination and disenfranchisement of the blacks to an end, at least legally. The writer reminds us that the fight and struggle of these leaders has still not come to an end, as these social evils are still very much prevalent in our societies. It was not long ago that Indians were being discriminated by colonial officers. It was not long ago that Dalits in India were being denied entry into public places by the upper castes. It was not long ago that blacks in South Africa and the United States were being mistreated and discriminated against. Even though these countries have achieved a lot of progress through legal and constitutional changes, not much has changed on the ground. Because over the last few years, we have been witnessing a resurgence of casteism, racism, classism, and elitism, and as well as orthodox conservative views around the world. Take for instance, how the lockdown in India has exposed the inherent class and caste divide of the Indian society. The lockdown snatched away the livelihoods of lakhs of migrant workers around the country and pushed them further into hunger and poverty. Most of the migrant workers in the country happen to be from the lower classes and the lower castes, and we have seen that over the last 2.5 months, they have been completely let down by the central government, by the state governments, and as well as by India's upper and middle classes. The intention of this argument is not to say that this was deliberate on the part of the government and India's upper and middle classes, but the intention is to point out that the government and the society failed to respond to the crisis being faced by the migrant workers. Even after 2.5 months, migrant workers have not received any substantial relief, and this goes on to show the inherent class and caste divide that is prevalent in the Indian society, which also reflects in government policies. Something similar can be seen in the United States and Europe as well. In the US, racism and white supremacy is on the rise. The best illustration for this is the George Floyd incident. Then in Europe, neo-Nazis are on the rise, who pose a threat to religious minorities and refugees in Europe. Then even in communist societies such as China, which claim to be against such divides and inequalities, which claim to establish an equal society, we get to witness a different form of oppression and discrimination that seeks to suppress the voices of dissent against the mighty state. This can be seen in the case of Dr. Li Wenliang, who was one of the first doctors to raise an alarm when the COVID-19 outbreak was reported in Wuhan. But his warnings were brushed aside by the Chinese state authorities, and he was even discredited for disrupting social order. At the end, the doctor himself succumbed to the disease, and it goes on to show how suppression of dissent is also a form of discrimination and oppression. So as casteism, classism, racism is raising its ugly head around the world, counter-protests have broken out, and a large section of people are speaking against these social evils in India, in the United States, and as well as in countries around the world. That's the reason why the death of George Floyd has triggered massive protests across the United States, and such protests offers us hope against the evils of racism, classism, and casteism. The writer says that these protesters are not merely following the path of Gandhi, Mandela, and Martin Luther King, but they themselves are the Gandhi, Mandela, and the Luther King of this era. According to the writer, these protesters are leading the world by example in our fight against these social evils. Now let's take up an article from page number 11. See, yesterday we spoke about a record increase in the population of Asiatic lions in the Gir Conservation Area, which was brought out by the 2020 lion census. But environmental experts and independent experts have questioned these census figures because they have pointed out that the Gujarat State Forest Department has used a 100-year-old outdated census methodology. And upon this, the death of lions due to the canine distemper virus over the last couple of years has not been well documented by the local authorities. So according to experts, the usage of outdated methodology and the failure to accurately count the deaths due to CDV could either result in the underestimation or overestimation of the lion population. See, the Gujarat State Forest Department has made use of a 100-year-old census methodology known as direct beat verification or the block count method. Under this method, hundreds of forest officials and volunteers are deployed at various watering holes in the animal's territorial range in order to physically spot, verify and count the lion population. So this is basically a people-intensive exercise. But the sole reliance on a people-driven exercise could also lead to a number of errors. And upon this, the accuracy of a people-intensive census is dependent on the number of people who were involved in the census exercise. Generally, around 2,000 people were required to effectively cover all the watering holes in the Gir conservation area. But according to reports, this year, hardly around 1,400 officials and volunteers were used by the State Forest Department. Usually for such census exercises, a large team of forest officials, volunteers from NGOs and independent experts are deployed, but this year the numbers have gone down as a result of the lockdown restrictions. So all these factors have led experts to question the validity and credibility of these census figures, and they are of the opinion that the census might have either underestimated or overestimated the lion population. Experts from the Wildlife Institute of India and other NGOs have said that instead of relying upon just one method, that is the direct beat verification method, it would be more effective to use a combination of methods as it is done in the case of tiger census. See, in the case of tiger census, the numbers are said to be more accurate because a combination of different methods are used. Along with direct verification by a team of forest officials and volunteers, the tiger census makes use of camera traps, drones, radio collars and GPS trackers to get a better estimate of the tiger population. In the tiger census, experts and officials also study the unique body marks and the pattern of yellow and black stripes on the tiger in order to uniquely identify each tiger. Along with this, statistical models are created in order to understand the predatory patterns and the size of the prey base in the territorial range of the tiger. In combination with these methods, other rudimentary techniques such as the analysis of pug marks, analysis of dung samples or excreta is also carried out in order to arrive at a more accurate number. Experts believe that a combination of these methods is said to give out a more accurate number, and it is said to be more scientific in approach. According to experts, in the case of lion census, none of these methods have been followed, and the State Forest Department has entirely relied upon the outdated direct beat verification method. But officials from the Ministry of Environment and Forest have contradicted these claims of independent experts. Officials of the Environment Ministry have said that camera traps are not suited for counting lions because lions do not have any unique markings like the tigers. But however, they have acknowledged that the improper documentation of CDV deaths in the Gir conservation area is an area of concern. But however, the death count was brought under control with the usage of imported vaccine. So while the state government and the central government are sticking by these numbers brought out by the lion census, the methodology and the accuracy is being questioned by experts. Now let's take up an article from page number 14. US President Donald Trump has authorized the imposition of sanctions against officials of the International Criminal Court who are investigating the Afghan war crimes case involving allegations of torture, war crimes and crimes against humanity allegedly committed by US military personnel and US intelligence officials during the Afghan civil war between 2003 and 2014. See, during America's war against terrorism in Afghanistan and during America's involvement in the Afghan civil war during this period, American military personnel and intelligence officials have been accused of committing torture, war crimes and crimes against humanity, and this case has been brought up at the International Criminal Court, and currently officials of the ICC are investigating these allegations. The US government has opposed this ongoing investigation at the ICC on various grounds. First and foremost, the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court. So according to the US, the ICC has no jurisdiction over American personnel and American officers. See, to understand this argument of the United States, first we need to understand the constitution of the International Criminal Court. It was established in 2002 through the Rome Statute, and it is headquartered at The Hague in Netherlands. The main objective of the ICC is to prosecute war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, etc. But the International Criminal Court does not have universal territorial jurisdiction. Its jurisdiction extends only to member states who have already signed and ratified the Rome Statute. And as per the Rome Statute, the ICC can take up these cases only when a member state is unable or unwilling to prosecute the authorities who are responsible for carrying out these atrocities. But if you look at the United States, it had only signed the Rome Statute, but it later withdrew its signature, and hence it is not a member state of the International Criminal Court. So as per the US, the ICC does not enjoy jurisdiction over American military personnel and American intelligence officials. But the proponents of the case have argued that these incidents took place in Afghanistan, which is a member state of the ICC, and since these alleged war crimes took place on Afghan soil, the ICC enjoys jurisdiction. So this clash between the United States and the ICC has led the US to derail the ongoing investigation, and it has even accused the ICC and its officials of having been motivated by Russia in order to discredit the United States and the contribution of its officers in the Afghan war. So as a further step to derail the ongoing investigation, Donald Trump has approved the imposition of sanctions against officials who are a part of this investigation, and as a result of these sanctions, the officials who are involved in the investigation, their assets in the United States would be immediately frozen, and henceforth their entry into the US would be prohibited. And for the sake of prelims, also note that India is not a party to the ICC. India has neither signed nor ratified the Rome Statute because India is concerned that the International Criminal Court could be misused by hostile countries in order to pursue their geopolitical interests against India. Since India is dealing with a number of internal conflicts in Jammu and Kashmir, in the northeast, and in the Maoist belt, it fears that by being a part of the ICC, it might create an opportunity for hostile countries such as Pakistan, China, their allies, or maybe even the Western countries to push cases against India in order to promote their respective geopolitical agendas. So for this reason, India has stayed out of the Rome Statute, and hence it is not party to the International Criminal Court. Now let's take up an article from page number 16, which deals with the first ever Indian Gaur census in the Nilgiri Forest Division. See, the Indian Gaur is also popularly referred to as the Indian bison. It happens to be one of the largest animals under the bovine category, and it is native to South Asia and Southeast Asia. The Indian Gaur is found to be inhabiting the tropical evergreen forests, the tropical semi-evergreen forests, and as well as the moist deciduous forests in the tropical areas. In the case of India, the Western Ghats, the central and northern parts of India, and the northeast of India happens to be a major habitat. But amongst all these habitats, the Western Ghats is extremely critical for the Indian Gaur as far as its population within the Indian subcontinent is concerned. Then within the Western Ghats, the Nilgiri biosphere region is a very important habitat for the Indian Gaur. This includes the Wayanad Wildlife Sanctuary, the Bandipur and Nagarhole National Park, and as well as the Mudumalai National Park. This animal is a threatened species and it has been listed as vulnerable on the IUCN Red List. So in the Nilgiri Forest Division, which is a critical habitat for the Indian Gaur, the first ever census has been carried out by using the direct sighting method, and it has revealed an approximate population of around 2,000 Indian bisons in the Nilgiri Forest Division. The census has also identified the threat posed by increasing incidents of man-animal conflict to the Indian bison. According to the census exercise, habitat fragmentation has emerged as a major threat, which is increasing the man-animal conflict incidents. The census has noted that in and around the Nilgiri Forest Division, there has been a change in land use pattern, wherein tea plantations in the Western Ghats, which largely employ temporary fences, are being turned into resorts and homestays, which employ hard fences that can block the traditional pathways of the Indian bison. So the coming up of hard fences in the traditional pathway of the Indian bison is fragmenting its habitat and thereby restricting its access to food. So this shortage of food is pushing the Indian bison closer to human habitation, because closer to human habitation there is easy availability of food, and as well as there is a lower threat posed to them by predators. So this increases the chances of man-animal conflict, and such incidents can be dangerous to both the animal and as well as the human beings. These incidents not only threaten the well-being of the Indian bison, but it can also threaten the locals who come in contact with the animal, as the Indian bison is known to attack human beings, leading to major injuries and even death. Such incidents pushes the locals to attack the animal, which further threatens the survival of the species. Now let's take up the practice questions for the day. Which of the following statements are correct? The Chief Economic Advisor is appointed to the Prime Minister's office. His or her rank is equivalent to the rank of Secretary to the Government of India. The Chief Economic Advisor is the ex officio cadre controlling authority of the Indian Revenue Service. One of the key responsibilities of the Chief Economic Advisor is to come out with the annual economic survey of India. Amongst the given statements, the first and the third statements are incorrect. Because see, the Chief Economic Advisor is appointed to the Department of Economic Affairs within the Ministry of Finance. To be more precise, the Chief Economic Advisor heads the Economic Division within the Department of Economic Affairs. And on an ex officio basis, he is the cadre controlling authority for the Indian Economic Service and not the Indian Revenue Service. So the correct answer is option C, 2 and 4 only. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 1, the Chief Economic Advisor has said that the path to India's economic recovery is still very uncertain, and he goes on to lay down the future prospects for the Indian economy. Now let's take up the next practice question. The geographical term Balkans corresponds to which region? Amongst the given options, the correct answer is option C. The term Balkans refers to Southeast Europe. See, the geographical term Balkans or the Balkan Peninsula refers to this region in the southeast of Europe. This includes countries such as Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, Albania, Macedonia, Montenegro, Greece, etc. The term Balkan is based on the Balkan Mountains that stretches from the Black Sea coast of Bulgaria through Serbia. This so-called Balkan Peninsula is bordered by the Adriatic Sea, the Ionian Sea, the Aegean Sea, and the Black Sea. The term Balkan also has a geopolitical reference. See, of late, the term Western Balkans is very much in news because the European Union is looking to expand its membership by including some of the Western Balkan states under the grouping. Then you might have heard of the term Balkanization, which basically refers to the breakup of a large state into smaller states that are usually hostile to each other. This term originated because the Balkan region throughout history has largely been under the Ottoman Empire. But by the earlier part of the 20th century, this region broke up into a number of small states which turned out to be hostile against each other. So that's the reason why geopolitically the term Balkanization is used in order to refer to the breakup of a large state into smaller states that are usually opposed and hostile towards each other. This question has been asked because the 100 years ago article from page number 7 makes a reference to the agreements on maps that were being signed after the peace treaty of the First World War, and this article makes a reference to the Balkan region. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following are West African countries? Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, Namibia, and Ghana. Amongst the given options, Namibia is not a West African country because Namibia is located in southern Africa. Whereas Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, and Ghana are West African countries, and hence the correct answer is option C, 1, 2, and 4 only. Please look at this map. West Africa includes countries such as Mauritania, Cape Verde, Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Ivory Coast, Ghana, Burkina Faso, Mali, Benin and Togo, and as well as Niger and Nigeria. Of late, a number of West African countries have been affected by terrorism that is carried out by jihadist outfits such as Boko Haram, which operates in Niger, Nigeria, and Cameroon. And there are other terror outfits affiliated to the Al Qaeda and the Islamic State that operate in Mali, Burkina Faso, etc. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 14, a terror attack has been carried out in Ivory Coast, and the attack has been claimed by a jihadist outfit that calls itself as the GSIM. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2019 prelims paper. Which one of the following is not a Harappan site? Amongst the given options, the correct answer is option C. Sogora is not a Harappan site. It is located in Gorakhpur in Uttar Pradesh. Whereas the other three happen to be Harappan sites where sufficient archaeological evidence has been found. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: discuss how Indian universities fare on the HRD Ministry's National Institutional Ranking Framework as compared to global rankings such as the QS World University Rankings. The second question: across the world, people are speaking up against racism, classism, and callous elitism. In this context, examine the ideals championed by the likes of Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, and Martin Luther King. So kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.